My name is Michael Sullivan, and I'm a priest. Or at least, I was. The day my life truly changed wasn't in a church, but in a cold, polished office that smelled of lemon wax and indifference. The bishop, a man whose hands had never known a callus, slid a file across his mahogany desk and gave me my final assignment, to tear down a forgotten chapel. He looked me right in the eye, a thin smile on his lips, and said in front of his smirking young aides, "They say faith can move mountains, Father. Let's see if yours can keep a roof from caving in on your head before the wrecking ball arrives." In that moment, 30 years of service felt like it had been reduced to a joke. It was the quietest, most profound humiliation I have ever known. What would you do if the life you dedicated yourself to ended with you being told to go supervise a pile of rocks? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The weight of that file in my hands felt heavier than any cross I'd ever carried. It contained a single faded photograph of St. Jude's Chapel, a small stone building being slowly strangled by ivy, with a massive waterfall crashing down on the rocks just behind it. The bishop didn't see a house of God. He saw a liability on a balance sheet. He spoke of budgets and structural reports, his voice smooth and administrative, which somehow made the dismissal sting even more. It wasn't malice, it was worse. It was complete and utter disregard. I was being sent to a place no one wanted, to perform the last rites on a piece of history he considered trash. I just nodded, my face a mask of obedience I had perfected over the decades. But inside, a quiet, stubborn fire had been lit. I took the file, the photograph of that forgotten chapel, feeling like both a death sentence and a calling. He saw a ruin. I saw a final test. My arrival in the Appalachian town of Havenwood did little to lift my spirits. The town was a mirror of the chapel, tired, broken, and slowly being reclaimed by nature. The paint was peeling off every storefront on Main Street, and the few faces I saw looked as weathered as the mountains around them. I stopped at the only gas station, and the old man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper. He just grunted, "You must be the new one." When I confirmed I was, he let out a dry chuckle and muttered, "Another one sent by the bishop to pick over the bones." The words hung in the air, thick with cynicism. There was no welcome here, no community to greet me. I was an outsider, a vulture in their eyes, sent to officiate the funeral of a town that was already long dead. The sense of isolation was immediate and absolute, a cold blanket settling over me. When I finally saw St. Jude's with my own eyes, I understood the bishop's cold logic. The photograph hadn't done it justice. The place was a carcass. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back, and the constant roar of the waterfall next to it wasn't peaceful. It was a monolithic, lonely sound that seemed to mock the chapel's silence. I pushed open the heavy oak door, which groaned in protest, and was hit by the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and a century of neglect. Dust motes danced in the weak light that streamed through the grimy, cracked stained glass windows. Every step I took echoed in the hollow space, my feet crunching on fallen plaster and dried leaves that had blown in through the holes. This wasn't a retirement project. This was a tomb, and I had been sent to make sure it was properly sealed before it was erased from the earth for good. That first Sunday was the loneliest day of my life. Out of habit, out of some deep, unbreakable part of me, I went to the bell tower. The rope was frayed and stiff, but I pulled. The sound of the old bronze bell was surprisingly clear and deep, rolling out across the empty valley, a call to no one. I waited. Of course, not a single soul came. So I walked to the altar, my footsteps the only sound besides the waterfall's endless roar. I stood there, in my worn vestments, and I delivered Mass to the empty, decaying pews. I spoke the words into the vast, damp silence, my voice sounding small against the enormity of the emptiness. It was the ultimate act of faith, or perhaps the ultimate act of foolishness. I was a priest with no flock, in a church with no future, in a town with no hope. The humiliation from the bishop's office had followed me here, and had become my constant, silent companion. That lonely mass in that empty chapel, it took me back to a place where silence was just as heavy, but filled with a different kind of emptiness. I grew up in a hollow in West Virginia, a place defined by the coal seam that ran beneath our feet. My whole world was coated in a fine black dust, and the sound I remember most from my childhood wasn't birdsong. It was the long, mournful wail of the mine whistle signaling the end of a shift. My father would come home, his face so black with soot you could only see the whites of his eyes, and he'd sit at the kitchen table too tired to speak. He was a good man, a strong man, but the mountain was taking him piece by piece, and we all knew it. He gave his lungs to that darkness so my mother and I could have a roof over our heads and food on the table. That was his sermon, preached not with words, but with sacrifice. His hands were a road map of his life, thick, calloused, with coal dust ground so deep into the lines of his palms that it never truly washed away. He was a man of few words, and affection wasn't something he showed easily. But I remember one winter the snow was piled high and the wind was howling, and our old roof sprung a leak right over my bed. I woke up to a steady drip of icy water on my face. My father, without a word, got up on that treacherous roof in the middle of the night with a bucket of tar and a few old shingles. He didn't come back inside until it was fixed. The next morning, he just looked at me, his face raw from the cold, and nodded. That nod meant more than any "I love you" ever could. It meant he would always stand between us and the storm. It was watching him that taught me what real faith looked like. It was about doing, not just believing. When I told my parents I was going to enter the seminary, my mother cried. I think she was proud but also sad. She knew the life of a priest was a lonely one. My father just sat there for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. Finally, he looked up at me and said, "The good Lord doesn't need more men to talk about him. He needs men to do his work. Don't you forget that." That was his blessing, and it became the rule I lived my life by. I wasn't drawn to the priesthood for the Latin or the incense. I was drawn to it because I saw communities like ours, forgotten and struggling, and I wanted to be a man who showed up with a hammer in one hand and a prayer book in the other. I wanted to be useful, just like my father had been. I wanted to fix the leaks, both in the roofs and in people's spirits. It was in the seminary library, a place that smelled of old paper and beeswax, that I first discovered him, Father Thomas O'Malley. I found an old, leather-bound diocesan journal from the 1930s. Tucked inside was a faded article with a single, grainy photograph of a man in a dusty cassock, standing with a group of quarry workers in front of a half-finished stone chapel. The article described how O'Malley, sent to minister to the isolated workers building a dam, had built St. Jude's Chapel with his own 2 hands, using stone he cut from the surrounding hills. He wasn't just their priest. He was their brother, their mason, their carpenter. He lived their life, shared their hardships, and built them a house of God in the middle of nowhere. That man became a saint in my eyes. He was the embodiment of my father's words. Reading about O'Malley solidified everything for me. This was the kind of priest I was meant to be, not a scholar in a comfortable rectory, but a servant in the trenches. His story became my private vow. I swore to myself that I would always ask for the parishes no one else wanted. The ones in towns where the mill had closed, where the farms had dried up, the places the diocese had written off as a lost cause. I wanted to go where the work was hardest, where faith was tested not by theological questions, but by the daily struggle to survive. I wanted a life that would have made Father O'Malley, and my own father, nod in approval. A life of doing, a life of service in the forgotten corners of the world. My first assignment was a little church in a town called Redemption, though it felt like anything but. The place was on its last legs. The steeple was leaning, the paint was all but gone, and the furnace had died 5 years prior. The bishop at the time told me, "Do what you can, Father. We have no funds for that parish." It was a test, I knew. They sent the new ones to the hopeless places to see if they'd break. I spent that first year learning how to patch plaster, rewire old knob and tube electricity, and reglaze windows. I used my own meager stipend to buy secondhand lumber and bags of concrete. The old-timers in the town would watch me from a distance, not offering to help, just waiting to see how long I'd last. They'd seen priests come and go before. I remember the day I finally fixed the bell. The rope had snapped years ago, and the bell had sat silent. It took me a week of climbing up and down that rickety ladder in the bell tower, splicing ropes and greasing the mechanism, my knuckles raw and bleeding. When I finally gave that new rope a pull, the sound that rang out over the town was deep and clear. It was more than just a bell, it was a declaration. It said, "We're still here." That Sunday, a few more families showed up for Mass. An old farmer came up to me afterward, a man who hadn't said 2 words to me all year, and he pressed a $5 bill into my hand. "For the roof fund," he grumbled and walked away. It was the biggest donation I had ever received. It was a small victory, but it felt like I had moved a mountain. That became the pattern of my life for the next 30 years. The diocese would send me to a crumbling parish. I'd spend 5 or 6 years pouring my heart and soul into rebuilding it, physically and spiritually, and just when it started to feel like a home, I'd get a letter with my next assignment. Another broken-down church in another forgotten town. I never married, of course. My only bride was the church, and she was a demanding one. My life was a series of lonely rectories, simple meals eaten by myself, and the constant, quiet ache of a body pushed to its limits. My hands, like my father's, became a record of my labor, calloused, scarred, and often stained with paint or wood varnish. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a man like the bishop. They were the hands of a worker. I never owned much. A few sets of vestments, a toolbox that followed me from parish to parish, and a small collection of worn-out books. My personal savings were non-existent. Any extra dollar I had went back into the church or the community. I remember one family, the Millers, in a town where the factory had shut down. Their little girl needed glasses, but they couldn't afford them. I told them the parish had a special fund for things like that. That fund was my grocery money for the next 2 months. I ate a lot of potatoes and bread, but seeing that little girl read a book without squinting for the first time was a feast for my soul. Those were the moments that kept me going, the quiet acts of service that no one but God would ever see. My mother passed away about 15 years into my priesthood. On her deathbed, she held my rough hand in her frail one and looked me in the eyes. "Michael," she whispered, her voice thin as paper, "are you happy?" It was a question that cut right to the bone. I thought for a moment, thinking of the cold rectories and the solitary life. "I'm useful, Ma," I told her. "I'm doing the work, and that's enough." A small smile touched her lips. She understood. She had been married to a man who lived the same way, defined not by what he felt, but by what he did for others. She knew that for men like us, purpose was a deeper well than happiness. It had to be. Otherwise, the weight of it all would crush you. The physical toll mounted over the years. A bad back from hauling lumber, a knee that ached every time it rained from a fall off a ladder, and a general weariness that settled deep in my bones. I was a priest, but I was also my own janitor, groundskeeper, and handyman. I saw other priests my age moving into comfortable positions in wealthy suburban parishes, or taking administrative roles at the chancery. They drove new cars and took vacations. I never envied them their comfort, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I did envy them their ease. My path was a hard one, chosen willingly, but that didn't stop my body from reminding me of the price I was paying for my convictions. The memory of my father's final days never left me. He died slowly, suffocated by the very mountain that had provided for us. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, feeling the rasp of his breathing. He couldn't speak much, but his eyes were clear. There was no fear in them, only a quiet acceptance. He had done his work. He had kept his promises. In his death, he taught me my final lesson. Dignity isn't found in what you acquire, but in what you give away. You give your strength, you give your time, you give your very breath, all in service to something larger than yourself. I promised his memory that I would live my life in a way that honored his quiet, profound sacrifice. There were times I came close to breaking. I remember one parish in the middle of nowhere, a place so hollowed out by poverty and despair that the people had forgotten how to hope. They were suspicious of me, of the collar, of the very idea that things could get better. For the first year I felt like I was talking to a brick wall. I'd hold services for a handful of elderly women while the rest of the town ignored me. But I kept showing up. I fixed the broken steps to the church, planted a community garden on the church lawn, and started a free weekly dinner in the parish hall, cooking the food myself. Slowly, so slowly you could barely see it happening, the town started to thaw. People started talking to me, then helping. By the time I left, that parish hall was the heart of the town. It proved to me that no place and no person is ever truly a lost cause. Through all those years, the story of Father O'Malley and St. Jude's Chapel remained my guiding star. It was more than just a story. It was a testament to the power of a single, determined man to create something sacred and lasting out of rock and faith. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by the decay and indifference I faced, I would close my eyes and picture him, covered in stone dust, wrestling a block of granite into place as the waterfall roared beside him. That image was my prayer. It was a reminder that the most meaningful work is often the hardest, the loneliest, and the least acknowledged. He had built his church to serve the forgotten, and I had tried to live my life doing the same. And so, to be sent to St. Jude's not to restore it, but to preside over its death, it felt like a cruel cosmic joke. The bishop, with his polished desk and his condescending smile, wasn't just giving me an order. He was ordering me to dismantle the very symbol that had shaped my entire priesthood. He was telling me that the life I had chosen, the life of a working priest dedicated to forgotten places, was worthless. He was telling me that the legacy of a man like Father O'Malley was nothing more than a line item on a budget, a liability to be erased. The humiliation wasn't just about me, it was about every sacrifice, every calloused hand, every quiet act of service being dismissed as meaningless. Standing there in that decaying chapel, with the smell of damp earth in my nostrils and the roar of the waterfall in my ears, I felt the weight of it all. I felt the presence of my father, of my mother, and of the ghost of Father Thomas O'Malley. The bishop and his aides saw a pile of rocks. But I saw the sum of my life's beliefs. They thought they were sending me to a graveyard to bury a forgotten building. They had no idea that they had actually sent me home. They had sent me to the one place on earth that understood the language of my soul, a place built by a man who knew that faith wasn't about moving mountains, but about building something that could withstand the storm. The first few weeks were a blur of solitary labor. I'd rise before the sun, my breath misting in the cold air of the rectory, and get to work clearing the thick, thorny vines that clung to the chapel walls like a shroud. The work was hard on an old man's back, but the rhythm of it was familiar, almost comforting. I could feel the town's eyes on me. From the corner of my eye, I'd see a curtain twitch in a distant window or see a pickup truck slow down as it passed, the driver staring for a moment before shaking his head and speeding up. Their silence wasn't welcoming. It was the silence of a crowd watching a man attempt an impossible feat, waiting for him to fail. It was a heavy, patient, judging kind of quiet that settled over the valley and seeped into my bones. My first real taste of the town's sentiment came at the general store, the only one for 20 miles. The place smelled of sawdust and coffee. The owner, a man named Henderson with tired eyes and a permanent frown, watched me place a sack of concrete mix on the counter. He rang it up slowly, then leaned forward on his elbows. "Still trying to patch up that old rock pile, Father?" he asked, his voice not unkind, but laced with a weary pity. "You've got more patience than sense, I'll give you that." He said it with a half-smile, but the words landed like small, sharp stones. In his eyes, I wasn't a man of God on a mission. I was a curiosity, a well-meaning fool engaged in a pointless hobby. I just paid for my concrete and left, the bell on the door jingling my lonely exit. After that, I started to notice the change in the air. It was subtle at first. When I'd walk down the town's one paved street, conversations would die down as I approached. People who had been laughing and talking would suddenly fall silent, their eyes darting toward me and then away, followed by a whispered comment to their companion. It wasn't outright hostility, it was worse. It was the kind of look, you give something you feel sorry for but don't want to get involved with. I was becoming a local spectacle, the subject of hushed conversations and headshakes. The space around me grew wider, an invisible bubble of pity and skepticism that kept everyone at a distance. I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. The pity soon curdled into open mockery, especially from the younger generation who had no memory of the chapel ever being anything but a ruin. A couple of young men were always hanging around the town's only auto garage, and they took a special interest in my work. One afternoon, as I was struggling to haul a heavy waterlogged timber from the collapsed section of the roof, one of them, a big loud fellow named Dale, cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled across the road, "Hey, Father! Need a hand tearing the rest of that thing down? We could have it flat in an hour." His friends erupted in laughter. It was a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the roar of the waterfall. That was the first time the dismissal felt truly personal, like a direct blow. The smaller, quieter slights were somehow worse. I saw it happen with Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who attended the Methodist church, and who had, in the first week, given me a brief, polite nod. One morning she was walking down the sidewalk towards me. Our eyes met for a second, and a flicker of panic crossed her face. She immediately turned, pretending to be fascinated by a display of dusty fishing lures in a shop window, and then, when I was a few paces past, she quickly crossed the street. She couldn't even bring herself to walk on the same side of the road as me. That simple act, that deliberate avoidance, felt more isolating than any loud joke. It was a quiet, firm statement. You are not one of us. You are other. Even the mailman, a lanky man named Carl, who drove a rusted-out Jeep, felt the need to offer his dismissive advice. He'd hand me the occasional bill or diocesan newsletter with a sigh, as if the very act of delivering mail to this address was a burden. "You know, Father," he said one day, leaning out his window, "my brother-in-law had a piece of land like this over in the next county. Total wreck. He sold it to a lumber company for pennies on the dollar, but hey, at least he got something for it. Better than pouring good money after bad, right?" He was trying to be helpful, I suppose, but all I heard was that my work, my purpose here, was worth less than nothing. In his mind, I was a fool for not taking the first cheap offer to come along. In every other parish I had ever served, no matter how poor or broken down, there was always a gesture of welcome. A parishioner would bring a casserole to the rectory, or a family would invite me for Sunday dinner. It was a small thing, but it was a sign of acceptance, a thread connecting me to the community. Here in Havenwood, there was nothing. The rectory door never knocked. The phone never rang. My solitude was absolute. I was the town priest, a figure who was supposed to be a cornerstone of the community, yet I was treated like an eccentric hermit. The loneliness I had known throughout my life was a familiar companion, but this was different. This was a profound, soul-crushing sense of being a complete and utter outcast. The most painful moment came from the mouths of children. I was clearing brush near the edge of the property one afternoon when a group of kids rode by on their bicycles. They stopped a short distance away, pointing. I couldn't hear everything they said, but one boy's voice carried clearly on the wind. "That's him," he said to his friends. "That's the crazy priest who lives in the broken church." The other children giggled, a sound that was both innocent and cruel, before pedaling away as fast as they could. Children are like mirrors. They reflect what they see and hear at home. Their words confirmed what I already suspected. To the families of Havenwood, I wasn't Father Michael. I was a local legend, the town weirdo, a character in a cautionary tale. The disrespect wasn't just confined to Havenwood, it followed me all the way back to the diocese. Every week, I had to make a check-in call to the Chancery office. I usually got a young administrative assistant on the line, the same one who had been in the bishop's office, smirking. On the day I was given this assignment, his voice was always syrupy sweet, dripping with condescension. "And how is our little retirement project coming along, Father Sullivan?" he'd ask, the false concern in his voice making my stomach tighten. "Found any hidden treasures in the rubble yet?" The sarcasm was as thick as the damp air in the chapel. It was a weekly reminder that to the very institution I had served for my entire life, I was a joke. My dwindling personal funds eventually forced a more direct humiliation. I needed a few bundles of shingles to patch a particularly bad leak over the altar, but my account was nearly empty. I went to the town's small hardware store, the only place that sold building supplies, and asked the owner if he might let me have them on credit. I explained that the parish would pay him back as soon as the quarterly funds from the diocese arrived. He just looked at me with this incredibly sad, pitying expression. "Father, I'm sorry I can't," he said, his voice gentle. "There is no parish. There's just you and that pile of stones. It's a bad investment. I can't do it." To be told, to my face, that I was not just a fool, but a bad financial risk, was a new low. That moment in the hardware store sent my mind reeling back through the years, back to that little town of redemption. I remembered the day I finally fixed the bell, the clear, strong sound ringing out over the valley. And I remembered the old farmer, a man who hadn't said 2 words to me all year, coming up after Mass and pressing a crumpled $5 bill into my hand. For the roof fund, he had grumbled. That simple act of faith, of shared purpose, felt like it had happened in another lifetime, to another man. Here, my sweat and my sore muscles earned me nothing but pity. The stark contrast was a bitter pill, making me wonder if I had lost whatever ability I once had to inspire hope, or if this place was truly as damned as everyone believed. The waterfall became my constant roaring companion, and its voice began to change. In the beginning, I had found its power majestic, a symbol of God's enduring presence. But as the weeks of isolation wore on, the sound started to feel different. It no longer sounded like power. It sounded like laughter, a deep, booming, relentless mockery of my efforts. I'd be struggling with a piece of wood, my muscles screaming in protest, and the roar would seem to swell, a constant, indifferent sound that reminded me how small and insignificant I was. The waterfall had been carving this valley for thousands of years. My short, foolish life, spent trying to save a few stones from its spray, was nothing to it. The relentless tide of doubt from the outside world began to seep inside me. In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, sitting in the damp rectory with only a single lamp to push back the darkness, I started to ask myself the questions they were all whispering. Were they right? Was I just a stubborn old man, refusing to accept the inevitable? Was this an act of faith, or was it just my own foolish pride, my refusal to admit that the bishop had finally broken me? His words echoed in my head, over and over. Let's see if your faith can keep a roof from caving in on your head. Maybe it couldn't. Maybe I was just wasting the last precious years of my life, propping up a tombstone to my own vanity. I heard there was a town meeting being held in the old schoolhouse to discuss a proposal to sell some nearby land for a new county landfill. I felt it was my duty, as a member of this community, however unwelcome, to attend. I put on my best black shirt and walked in. The room, filled with about 30 people, fell completely silent. Every eye turned to me. The mayor, a portly man I'd seen around town but who had never acknowledged me, looked up from his papers with an annoyed expression. "Father," he said, his voice loud in the quiet room, "this meeting is for residents and property owners concerned with local property values." The message was unmistakable. My property was worthless, and therefore so was my voice. I turned around and walked out without a word, the collective weight of their dismissal pressing down on my shoulders. The final, most deliberate humiliation came a few days later. I woke one morning, looked out the rectory window, and saw it. Someone had hammered a crude hand-painted sign into the soggy ground near the chapel entrance, right by the road. In big, sloppy red letters, it read, "Fixer Upper. Cheap. H-A-H-A. They must have done it in the dead of night. It wasn't just a spontaneous joke shouted from a passing truck anymore. This was a premeditated act. Someone had taken the time to find a piece of wood, paint those words, and drive out here to plant it like a flag of mockery on my front lawn. It was a public declaration from the town, a branding. They weren't just pitying me anymore. They were actively laughing at me. As I stood there, staring at that ugly, dripping sign, with the indifferent roar of the waterfall filling the air, everything clicked into place with a terrible clarity. The whispers, the averted eyes, the sarcastic offers of help, the pitying looks, it all coalesced into a single, crushing realization. I finally saw myself the way they saw me. I wasn't Father Michael Sullivan, a priest who had given 30 years of his life to God and to the forgotten corners of his kingdom. No. In their eyes, I was simply the old fool with the worthless property. That label, so long whispered behind my back, was now publicly displayed for all to see. It settled over me like a funeral shroud, heavy and cold and suffocating. After that sign appeared, something inside me changed. A door closed. I pulled the sign out of the ground and broke it over my knee, throwing the pieces into the woods. But I didn't try to confront anyone. I simply retreated. I stopped going into town unless it was an absolute emergency. I arranged for a grocery delivery service from a town 30 miles away. My world shrank to the boundaries of the chapel grounds. The stones, the rotting wood, the damp earth, these became my congregation. My isolation was no longer just something imposed upon me from the outside. It became a fortress I started building around myself, a wall to protect what little was left of my spirit. My work became my only conversation, my hammer and trowel my only response. But in the deepest part of that isolation, in the silent, echoing space left by their scorn, something else began to grow. It wasn't despair. It was a hard, cold, quiet resolve. A feeling as solid and unyielding as the granite stones of the chapel itself. Let them laugh. Let them whisper their jokes and hammer their signs into the ground. They saw a ruin, a liability, an old fool. They saw only the surface of things. They couldn't see the history in these walls, the sweat and faith of a man like Father O'Malley baked into the very mortar. They certainly didn't know the quiet strength of a coal miner's son. Their disbelief would no longer be my burden, it would be my fuel. I would not do this for them. I would do it to honor the men who built things to last, and I would do it for myself. You might think that seeing that hand-painted sign, with its ugly red letters mocking my every effort, was the moment I finally broke. You'd be forgiven for thinking that. Any sane man would have packed his few belongings, turned the key in the lock for the last time, and left that pile of stones to the wrecking ball and the laughter of the town. You might picture me sitting alone in that damp rectory, the weight of all that scorn finally crushing what was left of my spirit. But you see, the truth is, that sign didn't break me. It did the opposite. It confirmed, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the granite in these walls, that I was doing exactly the right thing. Because what they didn't know, what no one could possibly have guessed, was that I wasn't just fixing a church, I was guarding a secret. Every pitying look from the hardware store owner, every whispered joke from the men at the garage, every person who crossed the street to avoid me, it was all a gift. Their ridicule was the most perfect camouflage a man could ask for. They wrapped me in a cloak of their own making, a cloak of foolishness and failure, and underneath it, I was able to move and plan without anyone ever looking too closely. They saw a crazy old priest trying to hold up a collapsing roof. They had no idea that I was the one holding up the sky, and that the foundation of this forgotten chapel was rooted in something far more valuable than their fleeting opinions. They thought they were laughing at a fool. In reality, their laughter was the sound that kept the wolves at bay, while I protected a treasure they couldn't even imagine. My knowledge of this place didn't begin the day the bishop slid that file across his polished desk. It began 40 years ago, in the quiet, dusty archives of a seminary library. I found an old diocesan journal, the one with the article about Father Thomas O'Malley building this very chapel. But what the official record didn't show was a single, brittle page that had been tucked inside the back cover, a page that had clearly been torn from O'Malley's private diary. It was covered in his cramped, hurried handwriting, and it spoke not of building with stone, but of safeguarding a trust. It was a confession and a testament, a secret passed into the silence of history, waiting for someone to listen. I suppose over the years other seminarians and clerks had seen that page, but to them it would have just been the rambling of a tired priest. They didn't have a coal miner's blood in their veins. The entry was cryptic, written like a parable. O'Malley wrote, "They believe my work is in the stone that faces the sun. But my true legacy, the trust I keep for a world that has lost its way, is shielded by the constant judgment of the water. It lies behind the altar, not in gold or silver, but in the paper promises of a better time. It will remain there until a man comes not to preach, but to work, a man who understands that the truest faith is found in protecting the flock, when the flock doesn't even know it is in danger." It was a message that a bureaucrat would dismiss as poetry, but to me, it was a blueprint. He was telling me where to look, and, more importantly, who should look. He was calling out for a successor, for a fellow laborer. So when the bishop, in his infinite and ironic wisdom, sent me here, it felt like the hand of God himself. I wasn't being sent into exile. I was being sent to answer a call that had been waiting for 4 decades. My work on the chapel wasn't random. The clearing of the vines, the patching of the roof, it was all necessary, but it was also a cover for my true purpose. The day I finally went to the wall behind the altar, the one perpetually slick with the mist from the waterfall, I wasn't looking for a leak. I was looking for the one stone that Father O'Malley had set without mortar. It took me hours of feeling along the cold, damp granite, my fingers raw, until I found it. A single, perfectly cut block that gave just a fraction of an inch when I put my shoulder into it. Behind the stone was not a cave, but a small, man-made chamber, dry as a bone and lined with slate. And inside, sitting on a small stone shelf, was a heavy, lead-lined box, about the size of a shoebox. The air that escaped when I finally pried the lid open was ancient, the smell of a sealed tomb. There was no heavenly light, no choir of angels. There was just the roar of the waterfall outside, and the quiet, profound weight of the object in my hands. It felt heavier than lead. It felt like the concentrated weight of one man's integrity and another man's hope. This was it. This was the legacy that Father O'Malley had given his life to protect, a secret he had taken to his grave, trusting that one day the right kind of man would come looking for it. I carried the box back to the rectory and opened it under the light of a single bare bulb. It wasn't filled with jewels or gold bars. It was filled with paper. Stacks and stacks of bearer bonds from companies I hadn't heard of in years, steel mills, railroads, manufacturing giants from before the Second World War, all perfectly preserved. Beneath them were bundles of 1930s currency, crisp and uncirculated, looking as if they had been printed yesterday. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a letter. It was from O'Malley, and it explained everything. He confirmed the story of a wealthy industrialist who, in the depths of the Great Depression, had liquidated his entire fortune, convinced the country was about to collapse. He entrusted it all to O'Malley, the one man he believed was beyond the reach of greed. I knew the value was significant, but I had no real concept of what I was holding. It took me a month of careful, discreet inquiries, using an old friend from the seminary who was now a financial lawyer in a city 3 states away. He worked through intermediaries, never revealing my name or the location. The numbers that came back were staggering, almost nonsensical. The old currency was a collector's dream, worth hundreds of thousands, but the bonds, which had matured and accrued interest for over 70 years, were the real treasure. When the final conservative appraisal was done, the total value of the contents of that box was $67 million. $67 million. In that moment, I thought of that hardware store owner, refusing me credit for a few shingles. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. Father O'Malley's letter made the industrialist's intentions perfectly clear. This fortune was not a gift to the diocese. It was a lifeboat. The industrialist had seen the poverty of these mountains, the way people were forgotten by the world, and he wanted to create a reserve, a secret fund to be used only in a time of absolute desperation to rebuild a community from the ground up. He had stipulated that it should never fall into the hands of a committee or a bureaucracy. It was to be administered by a single steward, a person of faith who understood the land and its people. O'Malley had been that steward, and upon his unexpected death, the secret had been sealed away, waiting. The money wasn't just money. It was a sacred charge. To have handed that discovery over to the bishop would have been the greatest sin I could possibly commit. I could picture it perfectly. The money would be absorbed into the diocesan general fund, celebrated as a quote, miraculous windfall, and then allocated to build a new wing on a suburban Catholic high school or to recarpet the chancery offices. Havenwood and St. Jude's would get a plaque, perhaps, but the land would still be sold, the chapel demolished, and the town left to rot. The bishop and his aides saw this place as a liability to be erased from a balance sheet. They would never understand that the money wasn't found here. The money belonged here. It was the soul of this place, waiting to be reawakened. My silence, therefore, was not a choice. It was a duty. I was not hiding a treasure for my own gain. I was honoring the last will and testament of 2 dead men who had placed their faith not in institutions, but in the integrity of a single individual. Every day that I woke up and faced the town's scorn, I wasn't just enduring it. I was actively fulfilling the most important part of my mission. I had to become the fool they imagined me to be. I had to be the harmless old priest with a lost cause, because that was the only way to protect the secret from the very people, both in the town and in the diocese, who would have destroyed its true purpose. My humiliation was a shield, and I held it up every single day with a quiet and resolute heart. This knowledge changed everything. When Dale yelled his jokes from across the road, I didn't hear an insult. I heard a lost young man with no future, a boy who didn't know that I held the key to a life for him that was better than hanging around a garage. When Mrs. Gable crossed the street, I didn't feel the sting of rejection. I felt a quiet sorrow for her fear, a fear I now had the power to heal. And when I tore down that hand-painted sign, I wasn't acting out of anger. I was clearing the ground for a garden they couldn't yet see. I was no longer a victim of their judgment. I was the silent guardian of their future, and the weight of that responsibility was far heavier than the weight of their scorn. I began to understand true power. It has nothing to do with a title or a fancy office. It's not about having your voice heard at a town meeting. Real power is silent. It's the ability to effect change without anyone ever knowing your name. It's the quiet, steady work done in the shadows for the benefit of those in the light. In their eyes, I was powerless, a man with a worthless property and a worthless voice. In reality, I held the fate of their entire town in a lead box under my bed. This wasn't a source of pride. It was a terrifying and humbling burden. I was just a simple priest, a coal miner's son. But I had been entrusted with the tools to perform a resurrection, and I could not afford to fail. My solitude was no longer a curse, it became a strategy. I needed the isolation to think, to lay out a plan that was worthy of the trust I had inherited. I spent my nights not in prayer for my own sake, but in a kind of focused meditation, poring over maps of the town, reading about sustainable economies, and learning about charitable foundations. I had to become more than a priest. I had to become a financier, a city planner, and a ghost, all at once. The roar of the waterfall was no longer a sound of mockery. It became the sound of my own thoughts, a constant, powerful reminder of the force I was about to unleash. A force that would be just as relentless and just as transformative as the water that had carved this valley. Every nail I hammered, and every stone I lifted took on a new meaning. I wasn't just trying to keep the rain out, I was preparing the vessel. This chapel, St. Jude's, would not be a tomb. It would be the heart, the silent, beating heart, from which the lifeblood of this community would flow once more. The physical labor grounded me, kept my mind clear. As I worked, my hands becoming calloused, just as my father's had been, I felt a connection to him, and to Father O'Malley. We were builders. They built with coal and stone. I was about to build with hope, but it was all the same work. It was the quiet, thankless, essential work of making a place for people to live with dignity. So you see, they weren't watching an old man's final pathetic failure. They weren't watching a fool waste his last days on a pile of rocks. They were witnesses to the beginning of a miracle, and they were completely blind to it. They saw an end, a demolition, a final chapter written in red ink on a diocesan budget. What they were really watching, from behind their curtains and through their pitying eyes, was the slow, patient, and deliberate foundation of their own salvation. And the first act of that salvation would be the restoration of this holy place, not with their help but for their benefit. They thought the story was over, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that it was just about to begin. I spent that entire night sitting on the cold stone floor of the chapel, the open lead box beside me, the roar of the waterfall, my only counsel. The sheer weight of what I had found was crushing. $67 million. It was a number so large it felt like a fiction. My first thought, a fleeting and bitter one, was of the bishop's face, if I were to walk into his office and dump that box on his polished mahogany desk. I imagined the shock, the greed, the frantic backpedaling. I pictured the faces of the townspeople, their jaws dropping in disbelief. But that feeling passed as quickly as it came. Revenge is a fire that warms you for a moment, but leaves you in ashes. To reveal the secret would be to betray it. The diocese would swallow it whole, and the town would be poisoned by the sudden, unearned wealth. No, the legacy of Father O'Malley and the trust of that long-dead industrialist deserved better. It deserved a steward, not a showman. My decision, made in that cold, silent darkness, was not to give them what they wanted, but what they needed. And what they needed was a miracle they would never understand. The very next morning I began to move. My first call was to an old seminary friend, a man named Arthur, who had left the priesthood to become a tax attorney in Philadelphia. I trusted him not because he was a lawyer, but because he was a man who, like me, had seen the difference between the Church's laws and God's justice. I told him only what he needed to know, that an unexpected, anonymous inheritance had come to my parish, and that it needed to be managed with absolute discretion. We spent weeks on the phone, speaking in careful, coded language. Together we created the St. Jude's Fund, a charitable foundation with a board of directors consisting of 3 names, all of them deceased priests from the 1940s. It was a ghost corporation, an entity with no face, designed to be an invisible hand. The first transfer from the bonds was a small fraction of the total, just enough to begin the work. I felt a strange calm as I signed the papers. I was no longer just a priest. I had become a ghost, an architect of a future no one else could see. The first truck arrived in Havenwood a month later. It was a flatbed, carrying a load of new oak timbers and bundles of Welsh slate for the roof. The sight of it brought the town to a standstill. Henderson from the general store, Dale and his friends from the garage, they all just stood there, staring, as the crew began to unload. I had a story prepared, simple and boring enough to be believable. When the mayor finally worked up the nerve to come and ask, I told him the truth, or a version of it. An old parishioner's estate finally cleared probate, I said, my voice calm and steady. She left a small fund specifically for the chapel's historical preservation. The word small was the key. It was a lie that felt more truthful than the reality. They accepted it because it made sense to their small world. A little luck for the crazy old priest. They still saw me as a fool, but now I was a lucky fool, and that was a kind of progress. They watched, baffled, as the chapel was reborn, stone by stone, slate by slate, its stained glass windows once again, glowing like jewels in the afternoon sun. But the chapel was only the beginning. Once it stood whole and beautiful again, a testament to what had been, the St. Jude's Fund turned its quiet, invisible gaze upon the town itself. An anonymous grant was offered to the town council to repair the roads. Letters began arriving at the homes of small business owners, offering zero-interest loans to renovate their storefronts, signed only by the foundation. The old abandoned textile mill at the edge of town was purchased by a holding company no one had ever heard of, and a notice went up announcing it was being converted into a modern trade school, offering free tuition to any resident of the county. Hope, an emotion this town had forgotten, began to return, not like a flood, but like a slow, steady rain soaking into dry ground. They never connected it to me. I was just the quiet priest in the beautifully restored church, a man who kept to himself. I would sit in my rectory at night, looking out at the new street lights on Main Street, and I would feel a profound sense of peace. I was a ghost, and my work was finally being done. In the end, my dignity was not restored by a confrontation or an apology. It was restored by the quiet, undeniable truth of my actions. The town of Havenwood was saved, not by a handout, but by an opportunity. The people who had mocked me now lived in a place with a future I had built for them in secret. The bishop, hearing of the miracle in Havenwood, could only send a polite, confused letter of commendation, never suspecting the truth. I never told a soul. My reward wasn't their gratitude or their respect. My reward was the work itself. It was the knowledge that I had honored my father, I had honored Father O'Malley, and I had honored the vow I made to myself all those years ago. They saw a worthless pile of stones, but I knew its true value. It was a foundation, and on that foundation, a forgotten community was given a second chance at life. That was a justice far more profound and far more lasting than any spoken word could ever be.